Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming. This is a really flattering turnout. I will try to get my voice to reach the back of the room, but there are a lot of bodies in the way between me and the back of the room, so my voice might get lost in there. Let's see, how do I want to do this? Cool, okay. So I'm going to talk about big data. And I'm going to define big data, and when I define big data, I'm going to violate one of my basic principles, rules, guidelines for making presentations. I'm going to put up a whole bunch of text on one slide. Don't ever do that, right? Nobody likes to read big blocks of text. I didn't know a better way to do it, really. There's one particular definition portion where this big block of text will have to do some work. Later in the presentation, there will be another big block of text, a quote from a journalist to sort of explain one of the phenomena I'm talking about. Now this presentation comes out of stuff I've been working on, things I've been thinking about in terms of the research profile of the University of Virginia right now. Like many state universities, the University of Virginia is looking for some sort of edge in its research profile, some way to establish itself as a leader quickly, right? Because we're all struggling to find that niche. The problem is, the University of Virginia is one of about a dozen, maybe more, universities that are trying to establish themselves as leaders in this field of big data. And by field of, I mean practitioners of big data-based research. And I'll get into what that means in a little while. What I've been trying to do, my contribution to the conversation, not being someone who knows how to deal with relational databases, not being someone who writes code, not being someone who's quantitatively skilled, just someone who has a voice that reaches the back of the room. That's my primary skill in life. I'm trying to convince the provost and everyone between me and the provost that we can take advantage of some inherent strengths where I work right now. And those strengths involve the ability to talk about and start debates about and start research projects about law, ethics, and the philosophy of science, to name three big areas, all of which have something to say about how we are going to manage large collections of data in various parts of our lives. So I'm sure you're full of suspense at this point of what that means. This project that I'm involved in is meta scholarship in a sense, right? I'm trying to set out an agenda. I'm trying to spur further thought, further investment, further research in certain areas that I would like to contribute to, but it's not necessarily stuff that I'm going to do primary research on. I have another project that I'm not going to talk to you about, although it probably sounds better to you. And that stems directly from the last book I did. The last book I did is called The Googlization of Everything and Why We Should Worry. It came out in 2011. In the composition of that book, I found myself unsatisfied. Right? Anytime you write a book, a couple of things happen. First of all, you stress every personal relationship in your life. That's number one. But number two is that you often develop intellectual itches that you can't scratch even by finishing that book, right? So questions left unanswered, things that burn out, things you wish you could have tackled in that book if only they had let you put another 100 pages in there, you know, or given you another year to work on it. Of course, that's not how the real world works. So when I left that book, when I sent it off and I said, no more. It has to live whether it's good or not, right? With my publisher, I had two big questions. One was actually about this big data stuff. Because as you'll see, Google is one of the leaders in addressing the practice of big data manipulation, collection, manipulation, execution, and so forth. But the other area is the area of corporate social responsibility. Something that Google, as you probably know, is quite invested in. Google is one of the leaders in trying to articulate a vision for a responsible technology company, and a lot of companies are emulating what Google's been doing. It's an important part of what it means to work at Google. In many ways, that sense of doing good in the world is part of the wage that Google pays to its employees. So that is actually going to turn into my next book, and my next book's going to be called Be Evil. And it's going to talk about the strengths and weaknesses, the benefits and costs of corporate social responsibility. You may be saying now that's a far more interesting topic than what you're about to hear, and I wouldn't argue it, which is why it'll be a freestanding book. Excuse me, but for the purposes of this talk, because this is such a unique institution at a unique university. Because I knew I would be addressing people from the information studies field, the journalism field, the media studies field, the communication field, I thought that this subject would plug well into a lot of what we're talking about here. All right. This did not move forward. There we go. All right, here's two films you may have seen. You've probably seen at least one of them, right? I'm not getting what I need here. Okay. The film here, anyone know what film that's from? Yeah. The Conversation, what year? Oh, anybody help? 74 it is, 74, right. So basically, The Conversation, 1974, what was it about? Eavesdropping in a way, right? Surveillance, right. So this gentleman's, the character's name is Harry Call. Harry Call is a private investigator with a very specialized skill set. Most of what he does is audio surveillance. He plants microphones and he uses high-power microphones to listen in on conversations of private citizens. He does so and is paid by lawyers, other private investigators, subcontracting. We're not really sure exactly who hires him all the time, and he doesn't even want to know. Harry Call is emotionally stunted. Harry Call feels like he's just doing a job. He doesn't want to confront the morality of what he's doing. He turns out to be a very devout Catholic. He goes to confession. He feels really guilty about the prostitutes he visits. He's actually a very fascinating character. And Harry Call is so deeply cynical about his job and yet idealistic about everything else in his life. And the whole plot unfolds in a way that takes his character apart. He collapses because he can't make sense of a particular event that he ends up playing a small part in, which may or may not have resulted in a murder. If you've ever seen D'Antonio's film Blow Up from about a decade before that, it's essentially the audio version of that. So there's a whole lot that's going on in this world of surveillance that Harry Call is involved in, right? And Gene Hackman plays him brilliantly. As you'll notice, Gene Hackman, here, he was in his, whoa, sorry. I did not mean to do that. I hit the wrong button. There we go. So Gene Hackman is actually in his late 20s here, despite the receding hairline. And he is, let's see, 24 years older here, and yet same receding hairline, right? So, and the guy's amazing in the sense he looks the same age, no matter what age he is. So Gene Hackman is playing Harry Call, and the surveillance systems he's using, the information ecosystem in which he's existing in 1974 is very analog, right? There's no digital technology, but there's a moment in this film where he walks through a trade show to get all the new tools for surveillance. And you can see just how advanced surveillance technology was in 1974. And people were fascinated by this. Filmmakers are fascinated by this. August 1974, David will tell you, right? August 9th, 1974, we lost a president. He stepped down in shame because he was playing a part in an elaborate set of surveillance shenanigans, right? So the whole country is burning about this level of surveillance going on at the time that was ostensibly government-based, but we all kind of suspected that these technologies were being used by other areas of life. And in this film, we see a huge infrastructure of privately funded surveillance as well. But all the surveillance is what you might call point-to-point. It's one person listening in on a designated target during a specific period of time to gather information about a subject, maybe just information to embarrass that subject, right? But so it's small data surveillance, right? By small data surveillance, I mean, like, you know who you're going to listen to. You know who you're going to photograph. And you go and you look and follow that target, like you would expect a private eye to do, right? Small data. You're collecting very small bits of data, easily manageable. You know, it's old film, it's magnetic tape, etc. 24 years later, this movie comes out. Anyone seen the movie? Yeah. Enemy of the State, right? Gene Hackman, Will Smith. 1998. The amazing thing about Enemy of the State is, if you watch it now and you don't know it's 1998, you might actually think it happened after 2001, because so many of the issues that it brings up about surveillance infrastructure are now obvious parts of our life. But in 1998, it revealed a lot to us about the extent of state-based surveillance through electronic means, modes of listening, modes of data valence, meaning gathering up signals and data trails from credit card use, from discount card use. All of these elements of surveillance work their way into the plot as Will Smith's life falls apart, and he turns for help to Gene Hackman's character. Gene Hackman's character is actually called Edward Lyle. We think it's actually a pseudonym. We think, right? There are hints about this, but of course, everyone who saw the conversation, who then saw the enemy of the state, went, no, Harry Call just retired and went into hiding and popped up in Washington, D.C. as Edward Lyle. And you know, because Edward Lyle has scrubbed his background. There's some sense that at some point he worked for the National Security Agency or the CIA. We're never really sure. But he certainly understands all their methods. And so he helps Will Smith get through this elaborate set of challenges to his life. I don't want to give away too much of the movie. If you haven't seen it, it's really great. So basically what we're seeing here is in 24 years, the information ecosystem in which surveillance takes place shifts dramatically. This is all about small data surveillance. This is all about big data surveillance. Will Smith is caught in a net of data. He discovers very quickly the extent to which every move of his is tracked even before he becomes a target. Elaborate reasons he becomes a target of surveillance. But even before that, he left such a rich trail of data that it was very easy for the people who were after him to mess with his life and completely disrupt it, to find out about old affairs, to find out about business dealings, and to embarrass him and destroy his credit and all kinds of other things. And so this was a very revealing moment about the extent to which data has encompassed us without us really acknowledging how that happened. Now, I tell this story with these 2 points in time 24 years apart. But it's very important to remember that when we talk about the era of big data as if that's a 21st century thing, we miss the point. Because actually the era of big data has its roots in the 1960s. It has its roots in the 1960s because in the 1960s there were a couple of very important commercial and technological and governmental, maybe revolutions is too strong, but maybe not, going on. Number one, credit cards and credit agencies became everyday phenomena for Americans between 1965 and 1975. Rapid consolidation in that field. Visa and what was then, what became MasterCard. Actually, Visa was called Bank Americard before Visa. These became conglomerates or coalitions of banks working through a customized system. All of a sudden, credit cards were usable in firms and businesses of all levels. Before the mid-1970s, to use an actual credit card with magnetic stripe was actually a pretty rare thing. Gas stations, but not all gas stations used them, and Sears, pretty much. But between 65 and 75, you see a rapid rise of widespread consumer credit card use, and to do that, to justify giving everyday people a few $1,000s of credit, required an elaborate database run by these banks, by these services like Visa and MasterCard, to be able to find out if we were worthy, right? To make sure that we didn't have bad records. To make sure we didn't have bad records, they had to keep records. So all of a sudden you have this massive expansion of data collection and analysis on everyday American consumers between 65 and 75. Also between 65 and 75, the rise of the administrative welfare state as embodied in the computer database, as embodied in the mainframe server. So you have companies like IBM getting into business with the government, what became ultimately Perot Systems. Ross Perot, who ran for president a couple decades ago, is the richest person to ever live off of welfare. Most of the billions he made was off of contracting with states to run their welfare systems through his database business. So you have this whole industry of databases set up, again, to track the behaviors and benefits of Americans. Social Security before the 1960s was basically run with piles of paper and filing cabinets. By the 1960s, it becomes all computerized. It becomes all on magnetic tape. That was a huge, Social Security becomes a huge, huge endeavor by the 1960s as the first people who went on to Social Security in the 30s started receiving benefits. It became a lot more difficult to manage. And there were a lot more Americans by the 1960s, right? So those two things happened. Along with that, you find the American surveillance state, right? The FBI, the CIA, and what was not acknowledged yet to be but soon acknowledged as the National Security Agency, started using the very same technologies, as did the Internal Revenue Service. There were more Americans. Americans were up to more activities. There were more bureaucratic needs to track behavior. And so basically, Americans became subjects of data between 1965 and 1975. Subjects of data, producers of data, leavers of data trails. And yet, it didn't feel any different to be an American in that sense, right? By an American in 1965 versus an American in 1975 wouldn't say, I'm leaving so much data, so much more data than I did in 1965, because you just don't sense it. In fact, we didn't really start talking about this stuff until the late 90s, when through some journalistic efforts we became suddenly aware of the extent to which the National Security Agency was tracking a lot of different behaviors. And again, this was before 9/11, before we had this sort of obvious visual sense of a security state. So my case here is that there is a deep, complex social and technological history and cultural history of big data. Big data is not a present tense phenomenon. It started getting big in the mid-1960s. It got steadily bigger through the 80s and 90s as computers got more powerful, as businesses found reasons to invest in data collection and manipulation. And by the first decade of the 21st century, the aughts, big data was a given, especially in government and commercial areas. Again, we're able to retain terabytes of data now at no marginal cost. We're able to process tremendous amounts of data at very low cost. Our processors are more powerful than ever. What we haven't figured out actually is how to move this data quickly across the globe. Even with the networks we have, it's still so slow that in many cases, companies and services involved in big data, like labs that do astronomy work with big data, find it so much easier to use UPS to ship disk drives around the country than to actually ship big collections of data over networks. So we're not quite built out technologically to handle this big wave of data. But nonetheless, over that period of time, we have encountered some very serious changes in how governments and firms and universities work. Now, what is big data? We've just begun to understand its implications. But there's no synthetic, comprehensive account of its history, no broad ecological account of its effects, no policy agenda beyond particular reactions to particular technological advancements. So institutions right now, by that I mean commercial firms, universities, government agencies, et cetera, institutions have tremendous incentives to invest in data infrastructure and almost no incentives to curb their behavior or to set defaults or policies in ways that are short of maximizing the total amount of data collection and manipulation, right? So all of the defaults in this entire data world in all these different institutions are set in favor of the institutions doing the collection and therefore not necessarily in favor of you and me, right? Not necessarily in favor of you and me. Well, what the heck does that mean? Well, here I get to the, no, I'm going in the wrong direction. That was the slide I was supposed to show you in a minute ago. Here's the big block of text, all right? So this is the kind of stuff I read in my spare time. This is the proceedings of the ACM 14th International Workshop of Data Warehousing and OLAP. I'm sure you read it. So the sad thing is I was looking for a pithy definition of big data for you, and basically for me too, and this is the best I could find, even though it's written in very jargony, computer science-y, information studies-y language. What this really gets to here is that we're talking about unstructured data. And when it says produced by high-performance applications, that just means produced by instruments that track us with incredible efficiency, like RFD devices, right? Radio frequency devices. If you got a passport in the last 5 years, your passport has a chip in there that is constantly sending out data to a particular kind of receiver, and we're all told to believe that only US border agents can read that chip, but that remains to be seen. Our credit cards all have chips and magnetic strips on it. Either data embedded in the chips or the strips connect to a database that has a tremendous amount of data about us. Every time you go to the supermarket and use one of those discount cards so you get the special sale price, you're contributing to a database about your consumer behavior, about your buying patterns. These are all high performance applications. Falling in a wide and heterogeneous family of application scenarios, meaning everybody's doing it. I guess I should have written this out. Everybody's doing it, right? And so basically we're talking about data storage, data accumulation, data storage, data analysis. And so scientists are creating tools and techniques constantly to try to make sense of more and more data. So what we've created is this massive surveillance system where almost everywhere we go, almost everything we do is tracked. And most of the stuff that gets tracked, most of the stuff that we do is mundane to us, right? So to us, each individual is small, is insignificant. If it weren't insignificant, we wouldn't even think much about it. When you go through a toll booth with E-ZPass, you don't think, I am being surveilled, I am being tracked. Unless you're Tony Soprano, who never used E-ZPass in the entire run of that show, because he knew better, right? He understands this stuff better than we do, right? So we have all these different ways that we leave what we think are insignificant trails in the moment, but in total, to somebody, these trails mean something. These little bits of data mean something. They only mean something in the aggregate. These are meaningless little data trails until they become part of the big. So big data is really about assembling a whole lot of little pieces of data in a way that is potentially meaningful. Potentially meaningful. How is it meaningful? Consumer profiling. That's one way. How does Amazon know to recommend something to you? Because it's been watching you for years. It's been watching you not only engage with Amazon, from that it knows a lot, right? It knows that when you move from this kind of book to this kind of book to that kind of book, you've created at least a triangle of data, and it can compare that triangle of data behaviors with 5,000 other people who've reached those 3 books in one search period and predict, well, that guy or some core of that group bought this 4th book after looking at those 3 books. And then with all of that data working relationally, Amazon is able to say, I think you might like this book. And you go, wow, Amazon, thanks. I wish my mother knew me this well, right? Or maybe you're glad your mother doesn't know you that well, one or the other, right? So we've created this system, and look, it feels great, right? It's very convenient. How does Google know to read your mind, right? When you go to Google and you start typing in a search in the bar, all of a sudden it's dropping down these suggestions for you, and you're going, oh my goodness. The little elves in Google are in my computer, and they're watching me constantly, and they know exactly what I want. You know, that is a pretty stunning thing, and it's achieved because whether you knew it or not, Google is watching everything you do. Again, not just when you're interacting with Google. It would be weird enough and impressive enough if Amazon and Google were able to do all this tracking of you merely by your interactions with their sites, but they put little cookies in your browser, so they're following you around the web. They know all the other stuff you're doing. They're not the only ones. The New York Times does this. Most commercial websites do this kind of tracking because they're trying to get a picture of you. Get a picture of you in relation to everybody else like you. They know where you are because your computer's generating an IP number that is within a certain range of some institution. They also know where you are based on your IP number because there's a geographic designation attached. They know what kind of browser you use. They know what kind of operating system you use. And they're able to more than triangulate this, right? Octangulate this set of data to precisely predict what kind of search results you want, what kind of books you want to read, what kind of ads you want to see on Facebook. Now, I know right now you're saying, so how come Facebook ads are so wrong? Right? Because they are, right? The last time you looked at Facebook, you went, why do I want that? Right? And that's because Facebook hasn't figured out how to do this yet. That's the little secret. Why is Facebook stock tanking? Because they have yet to crack the code of figuring out how to do this incredible data mining job and actually produce something. So that's what's happening in the commercial sense, right? Now when we talk about surveillance, and a lot of people have been writing and talking about surveillance for the last couple of decades, because all this stuff has been not really sneaking up on us. We've all been aware of it. And as long as we go to the movies, you see enough Gene Hackman movies, you kind of get to paint a picture of what's going on. You might even get a little paranoid. So we've been talking about surveillance. And when people talk about surveillance or write about surveillance, there is a dominant framework, a dominant theory. And that dominant theory is the Panopticon. So the Panopticon was an idea that Jeremy Bentham, the British philosopher, came up with when he was thinking about prison reform. He was trying to figure out how to make sure that people who go to prison get acculturated or accustomed to behaving well, right? He assumed that people went to prison in the first place because they had not been well conditioned to operate according to the norms of polite society. That's one thing. The other thing is he assumed that they thought they could get away with it, right? So Bentham figured that the most effective prison, and prisons in the British Isles in those days were horrifying, and they still aren't that great. Filthy, mold-filled, human filth-filled, just filled with disease. They were places you sent someone to die a quick death, a quick and painful and horrible death of disease, mostly. So he wanted to reform that, like he wanted to reform so much else in England at the time. So he said, look, prisons have to be cleaner, they have to be well lit, they have to be well ordered. A well-ordered environment will help structure people's behavior. But the important thing is that there should be a watchtower that can see into every part of the prison. The watchtower should have lights coming out of it so that the prisoners can't tell if there's someone in the watchtower. The prisoners won't be able to know if they're being watched at any particular time. Therefore, they will have to assume they are being watched. This is very efficient use of labor. It means you don't have to always have a guard in the tower, or 2 or 3. Just occasionally, just to keep everyone honest. But for the most part, you have to convince the prisoners that they're being watched at all times. The assumption being, when you know you're being watched, you're probably behaving. That's the theory, right? The idea. You're probably behaving according to norms and expectations. You're at least trying to avoid punishment and humiliation, which those in power can bring to you, right? So that was the principle, that if we build a prison like this, then you can actually have better control of the population and over time create positive behaviors. So that's where the Panopticon idea came from, right? Being able to see everything, pan, optic, see everything seen, right? Now the Panopticon was never really put into practice in British prison, but a century and a half later, Michel Foucault, writing about social control in society, found this to be a very powerful idea, because he saw in the rise of that administrative state that I just talked about, with the whole, Ross Perot and IBM building mainframes and governmentality creating documents and paper trails for all of us. He saw in that the elements of coercion that we don't recognize as coercion. We know it when we have handcuffs on. We know it when the police hit us with a baton, but we don't feel it as coercion when we get a Social Security card, right? Or a library card for that matter. But Foucault wanted us to think of that as coercive in a different way, because he wanted us to understand that we were being constantly conditioned by our interactions with the administrative state to know that we were being watched by those in power, right? So he said the whole modern administrative state is part of the Panopticon, or has set up a Panopticon. And this is a really powerful idea. And he basically said the problem is that this encourages us or discourages us to push the limits of our behavior, right? That we're less likely to be personally liberated if we're constantly checking ourselves, thinking we're being watched, right? Is that a camera? Right? So that's right. So that was the idea. So as people write and talk about surveillance, this has been the dominant idea, that the problem with surveillance is it limits our imagination, limits our experience, and so forth. It keeps us in line. It's disciplining. I'm not sure I completely buy that, right? I'm not sure I completely buy that. I don't think that we have enough real evidence in the world to say that that's the direct effect it has on people. I think in many cases, you put a couple cameras on people and they start acting real weird. And we have plenty of reality shows to show that. That's a flippant reaction to Foucault, and I don't want you to take it too seriously. But it should actually get us to think maybe the Panopticon isn't the best, doesn't have the most explanatory power for what we are dealing with here. So I want to introduce this idea of the Cryptopticon. This is actually some street art from the Lower East Side of New York that a friend of mine took. I don't know if it's still there or not. So the Cryptopticon is the idea that we are constantly being watched, but we're not supposed to know it. It's hidden structures of surveillance. In the Panopticon, you're supposed to know there are cameras, right? When you walk around the streets of London or the streets of New York and those cameras perched on buildings or trees and parks stare out at you, you go into the subway and you see the cameras looking right at you. You go into Best Buy, you can't miss them. They got the camera and they got the screen saying, look, there's you, right? That is a Cryptopticon type model that's basically saying, don't you ever forget you're being watched. Well, I think that that's less interesting and less important than the structures of surveillance that we're not supposed to recognize as structures of surveillance, that are not in our face, right? Because it's not obvious that the fact that I get 2 for 1 on a loaf of bread at the supermarket means that I'm engaging in an act of self-surveillance, or I'm giving my activities to an agent of surveillance. That's not obvious. It's not printed there on the card or on the price tag. It may be in the fine print, but nobody ever reads the fine print when you sign up for those cards. When you use your Barnes & Noble card, when you use your Starbucks card, right? When you use EasyPass, it's not obvious these are instruments of surveillance. And the goal of these instruments of surveillance is absolutely not to get us to behave differently or better or to conform. Absolutely not. In fact, the goal of these instruments of surveillance is to get us to explore our niche affiliations and affections and affectations. Because now the key to marketing, the key to selling, the key to the key to security is not getting people to snap to attention and all march in a line, dress the same way and acting the same way. Now the key is to understand what we as individuals do with our choices, how we align ourselves into niches and interest groups, how we express our allegiances to certain products, to certain kinds of music, kinds of films, books. When it comes to security surveillance, it's about making sure that we actually have our guard down when we go hang out with the people who might not be that safe, right? We might find ourselves more relaxed and thus engaging in conversation with someone who the NSA or the FBI is watching. Whereas if we saw cameras everywhere, we might go, oh, I'm not going to go into that guy's house. I know he might be in some trouble and I'm not going to talk to him. Because what they want, they is basically the security agencies at every level. What they want is to have every one of us have our guard down and not recognize the extent of the surveillance. We're not supposed to acknowledge it because we're supposed to be relaxed enough to want to engage in our everyday behaviors and everyday lives, and thus they can trace our social connections. Ideally, they want to be able to eliminate the innocent among us who are merely making those connections in a non-important way, an unimportant way, but ultimately this is how they track collections of people who deal with each other who might be up to some plans that would concern the National Security Agency or the FBI, right? This is why in 2005, when the New York Times revealed that the federal government was engaged in massive telephone surveillance of American citizens, it was so important for the government to try to stop the New York Times, to convince the New York Times not to run that story. And once it ran, to try to convince everybody in the country that either the Times got it wrong or that the Times was basically acting unpatriotically to reveal the level of clandestine surveillance. The surveillance didn't have to be clandestine just because it was against the law. They never cared about that. The idea was that once we know that our phone calls are being listened in on, we are going to be a lot more careful on the phone. We will be as careful as Tony Soprano is on the phone. And they don't want that, right? They want us to be at ease. So the surveillance instruments don't necessarily fit into the Panopticon model. Some of them do. A much better explanatory instrument or model for the surveillance ecosystem we live in now is a Cryptopticon, one in which the instruments are hidden, the technologies are hidden, the goals are hidden. They're often presented as enhancing the user experience. That's the Googlese for it. Or recommending products, as Amazon does, right? Or speeding you through toll booths, which is what EasyPass does, when in fact state police all over the place have easy access to those very records. Anyone know this movie? No, this is great. This won the Oscar for Best Foreign Film in 2006. Yes, The Lives of Others, great. The Lives of Others, a German film. It's set just before the end of the Cold War, just before the Berlin Wall falls, just before German reunification. At this period in time, the government of East Germany is fraying, right? East Germany is under tremendous financial and economic pressure. People aren't living as comfortably as they had, largely because the Soviet Union is rising life in East Germany to the degree that it used to. And yet there remains such a high level of paranoia about the state and about state surveillance. In The Lives of Others, you can see both models, the Panopticon and the Cryptopticon at work. The lead character, George Dreiman, who's not pictured in either of these. This is Dreiman's girlfriend. She's an actor. This is the gentleman who works for the Stasi, the secret police, and he's assigned the mission of following Dreiman and his girlfriend around to figure out what they're up to. So Dreiman is a loyal playwright. He writes dramas that are pro-communist, that are pro-government, and therefore he is held in high esteem by the government. And because of this, he assumes he's got it made. He assumes he's totally comfortable. He is actually very friendly to the government. He lives a good life, nice apartment, has everything he needs. He doesn't cavort with people on the other side of the wall. He's friends with a few dissident playwrights, but doesn't agree with them. So what we see as people walk through this environment of East Germany is we see elements of the Panopticon in which instruments of surveillance and intimidation are obvious to certain characters, and they know when to snap into proper behavior and show that they're loyal to the state. But then ultimately, at one of the key moments in the film, Dreiman discovers the extent of the covert surveillance in his life. And this is the turning point of the film. I don't want to give away too much. You definitely want to see it. But here you see the way that Panopticon technologies and Cryptopticon technologies can work to help preserve an authoritarian state, actually a totalitarian state, and yet ultimately it fails. Ultimately it collapses on itself. All right. Here's an example of state security, big data, gone horribly wrong. There are two big lists that the United States government collects these days. They're actually a little bit older than 2001, but they've been rapidly expanded since 2001. One is called the no-fly list, and one is called the terrorist watch list. There are several 100,000 people on the no-fly list, and there are maybe as many as 1 million people on the terrorist watch list, although no one in the government will actually say how many people are on there. Those are estimates by non-government organizations. As of 2005, right, 7 years ago, 30,000 people had complained that their names were matched to a name on the no-fly list. 30,000 people had complained, basically between 2000 and 2005, that they had been prevented from reaching their flights because they were stopped for no-fly list screening. These people are false positives. False positives that's the term we use to say that there was some sort of database search that yielded a result that was not accurate upon further investigation, right? Falsely tagged as positive. These 6 people have all been tagged as false positives. Congressman John Lewis has been stopped at many airports over the years because it turns out there are bad people named John Lewis in the world. And so this civil rights hero and U.S. congressman is constantly stopped and asked to show other further identification to show that he is not one of the ne'er-do-well John Lui. Anyone know who the guy in the middle is? Yeah, Yusuf Islam, who is the former Cat Stevens. Can't come to the United States. He's on the terrorist watch list and the no-fly list. No one can say why, because of course none of the authorities who put him on the list will talk about it. And yet there is absolutely no reason to think that he's ever been up to any shenanigans at all. Senator Edward Kennedy, Ted Kennedy, for years was on the no-fly list. He would get pulled out of line at National Airport on his way to Boston on the shuttle that he had taken for many years after 9/11 because it turned out there was another Edward Kennedy who was, again, up to no good. So he was able to actually appeal to the Homeland Security Secretary to get his name off the list. Most of us can't do that. Let's see, Congressman Don Young from Alaska, the only Republican in this group, so just to say that it's not just people who might have an issue with the government. He is also in that situation. Nelson Mandela, terrorist watch list and no-fly list, until Condoleezza Rice intervened herself to remove him out of embarrassment once it was revealed that he and just about everyone else who's ever been active in the African National Congress has been on this. Anyone know who this gentleman is? Can't, maybe not everybody. What? No, that's good. No, his name's Shah Rukh Khan. He's one of the biggest stars in Bollywood films. He starred in a film called My Name is Khan, which was a film, sort of satiric film, critical of ethnic profiling, and in fact, he was on the no-fly list. Couldn't come to the U.S. to promote the film that was about the thing that happened to him. So all these folks have been involved in this sort of screening. The no-fly list, nobody really knows what gets you on it. And again, they won't say why. No one explains what you can do to get off it. There are ways you can go to websites and appeal to get off of it. They might or might not take you off. They might or might not tell you what your status is. The terrorist watch list, a whole different thing. And as we know, they don't actually talk to each other, which is why there's so many false negatives, right? The underwear bomber from last year or 2 years ago. This was a gentleman who was on the terrorist watch list, but not on the no-fly list. And so he was able to fly. Kind of a bad policy. So the question here is how we can instill transparency into this system. How can we as citizens have faith in this system, right? Because I can make fun of it, but I can also talk about the very serious work it does, right? Because clearly it does serious work. And we have to concede that we all want to keep bad people off of airplanes, and we want the authorities to watch over the bad people. We just want to make sure that they know who's bad and who's not, right? We want to make sure that they're not tracking good people, not impeding the movements of good people. So how can we ensure that we have some sort of transparency and some sort of, and this may be more important, accountability in the system? And what we've had with this big data system, as with many others, is a rush to build it before we carefully built in the safeguards about it. And those safeguards are more than law. It's more than the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment. It's more than the First Amendment. Those are there, but they don't seem to work when we need them in these systems, because the systems have a logic of their own, and they can mess with your life long before you're able to go to court about any of this. So what we actually need is on the front end to build in these systems of accountability. This is a scholarly agenda in and of itself, to come up with ways to help advise our various state enterprises how to build and maintain systems that are effective without being ridiculous, right? So how can we avoid this problem? Bart Simpson was actually on the no-fly list in one of the episodes of The Simpsons where he had, it turned out, failed to keep his seatbelt buckled during landing, and he was instantly put on the no-fly list. Okay. So that's the state issue. Now, if you've seen Minority Report, which came out in 2002, small independent film starring up-and-coming unknown actor named Thomas Cruise. In this film, you see a very interesting phenomenon. Again, this came out in 2002, but in many ways it speaks to our current state as well. Because all of the safeguards that we plug into our state institutions that are dealing with surveillance only help a little bit. In fact, in 1974, Congress did something really interesting. Probably not in reaction to the conversation coming out, but certainly in reaction to the abuses of the Nixon administration. In 1974, Congress passed some very strong citizen privacy laws that limited the extent to which different offices of the federal government could interact with each other. These were some pretty powerful laws that had a strong effect on how government operated. Basically, they said the IRS is collecting information on you all the time. The FBI can't just call up the IRS and say, hey, send over Siva's file. We want to check up on him. There actually has to be a rather elaborate process. Right? And the 1970s were full of these sorts of efforts to make sure that there was limited government abuse of civil liberties of people they were watching, which is why we have, for instance, the FISA court, which is supposed to have that sort of judicial safeguard to make sure that the FBI is not going on fishing expeditions and listening to everybody. Right? And again, after 9/11, the FISA court became quaint, as they said. So we have these laws, but we don't actually expect our government to adhere to them. In many cases, the government just ignores them. When President Ford came into office, August 9th, 1974, one of the first things he did was decide to ignore many of these privacy restrictions that Congress had passed and that President Nixon had actually signed. He did this at the urging of his then chief of staff. Anyone know who Ford's chief of staff was? Yeah, young Richard Cheney, who had a full head of hair back in those days. Actually, more hair than Gene Hackman in 1974. And so the yet-to-be Vice President Cheney at the time basically said, these sorts of laws limit the executive power so badly that we can't really take them seriously. So there was already instantly suspicion of them. When the Carter administration actually took them fairly seriously, and there were a lot of complaints in the national security elements of the government about the extent to which the Carter administration took them seriously. And then they were slowly and steadily ignored over the next 3 presidential administrations and then tossed out under the George W. Bush administration. But all that's nice, right? We can limit what the government can collect and we can limit what the government can share with itself. But that doesn't stop what Amazon collects. It doesn't stop what AT&T collects. It doesn't stop what Google collects or what Facebook collects. And what we're seeing now is this private-public synergy of databases. We are seeing state security agencies at all levels, often through these fusion centers, which are combinations of state and federal anti-terrorism organizations, purchasing commercial databases. Credit reports, marketing databases, and so forth, and just on the open market to try to get a tremendous amount of data about us so they can do these cross tabulations and try to generate associations. And so now we have a problem in the sense that we can't just pretend it's a state issue. We also have to ask questions about the extent to which we who generate this data might actually have a stake in their use. And so we have to start investigating and launching a conversation about the extent to which we might have some sort of personal stake and thus autonomy over the use, collection and use of this data. So that's the commercial thing. In Minority Report, you may notice the scene where Tom Cruise walks through a shopping mall and all of the billboards talk to him. Right? And of course, the entire premise of Minority Report is that the police have so much information about people that through the use of this sort of magical precog technology / human being, they're able to predict who's going to murder somebody by sensing a disturbance in the force or something. But that side, that put aside, the sort of background to the whole environment of Minority Report is all about constant methods of surveillance. Now, this big data revolution is also a scientific and intellectual revolution, to the point where now we see increased emphasis on data-driven science. And by data-driven science, I mean collecting a tremendous amount of information without any idea what each individual piece means, and trying to recognize patterns in the data. Patterns about radio waves going through space. Patterns about coral reef growth. Patterns about bloodborne diseases. Patterns about infectious diseases. Outbreaks of influenza. If you gather enough data, you can start to see a map differently. And some of this, almost all of this, is tremendously useful and valuable. But it's also creating some important questions about the philosophy of science, right? Because for most of the last few centuries, we have had certain scientific methods dominant, right? And those involve scientists imagining patterns in the world with very little data, hypothesizing about causes and effects, and then testing those hypotheses, in most cases to reject them and refine them. And that's how science sort of lurches along, right? But in a big data environment, we might be in a very different position. So Chris Anderson, who's the editor of Wired, wrote an article in 2008 called The End of Theory: The Data Deluge Makes the Scientific Method Obsolete, in which he argued that we no longer have to do science this old-fashioned way that is very slow and expensive and requires labs, et cetera. We just have to do everything the Google way. He actually basically said this. Google's already figured out how to understand the world, how to track flu across the world, flu outbreaks. Why do we want to do epidemiology the old-fashioned way? Why do we want to study disease the old-fashioned way when we have all this data available? And so he argued that we should shift all of these resources into data accumulation and analysis. Now, Chris Anderson is a master of hyperbole. And so scientists didn't take this article very seriously. But of course, the technorati took it very seriously. But basically, the idea of big data science has great virtue, because it does let us see things we couldn't see otherwise. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have serious methodological challenges, right? And again, what we're seeing in scientific inquiry at every level is a rush to build the systems and a rush to generate results and a significant shift in resources away from hypothesis-driven, lab-based inquiry into computer-based, data-driven inquiry, right? Because it's a zero-sum game in scientific funding. So I think we lack the conversation, and we need a conversation and a debate over whether this rather significant shift in our limited scientific funding is ideal for the long term. We also have to figure out some ethics about this, because a lot of the big data that we're dealing with is medical data, and medical data that is attached to particular patient records. And again, we have not figured out how to build in safeguards to make sure that individual health records are not potentially exposed in this process. These are problems that a lot of elements of the folks working in big data, a lot of sections of the people of the large community working in big data are addressing, but we're not doing it comprehensively. Now, part of the problem, one of the reasons we should address it philosophically as well, in terms of beyond ethics and law and policy, is that big data science can be described as a solution to the garbage in, garbage out problem, right? If your data is bad and you don't have a lot of it, then you're going to get corrupt results. But if you have enough data, even the garbage gets surrounded by the good stuff. I call this the Oscar Mayer model, because it's a lot like how Oscar Mayer makes hot dogs, right? And so the garbage becomes less of a problem in scientific inquiry. And I apologize for rushing through this part. I know I've taken too long. There's actually obviously a lot more to it. All right. So there are a number of other implications to the era of big data, to the rise of big data. And I want to conclude in sort of this clunky fashion. Number one, those of us in this room are privileged in the era of big data, believe it or not. Why? Because you know about it. Maybe you didn't know about it before you walked in, but now you know about it. If you know about it, you know how to manage it. If you know that Google's watching you, it's not a big deal, because you can figure out when you don't want to be watched, how to dodge the eyes of Google. When you know that EasyPass is watching you and you don't want EasyPass to watch you, you know to hide your EasyPass, put it in the glove compartment. Actually, you can't do that. You have to put it in lead envelopes. Whatever, toss it out the window, right? Now you know how to manage it. You can engage in what privacy advocates call self-help. The problem here is it's a completely new kind of digital divide. between those who have the skills and resources to fashion one's data reputation and those who do not. Because most Americans do not. Most Americans don't recognize the extent of big data surveillance in their lives. They don't recognize the effects that these systems have on their consumer choices and options. They don't recognize the effects that these systems have on which campaigns contact them to urge them to engage in which behavior. Because now political campaigns are all involved in big data research as well. So all of this affects our democracy, our economy, our personal behavior, and our security. And yet we're largely ignorant of the breadth of these problems. What you see over here, by the way, is another scene from Minority Report when Tom Cruise walks by a billboard, and the billboard actually asks him, he's wearing someone else's eyes. Long story. He had an eye replacement, so he would hide his identity. And the billboard asks him how he likes the clothes that this other guy bought, because it's reading his eyes. But in London right now, there are these billboards, these ads at bus stations that do facial recognition of the people walking by, and with a pretty high level of accuracy can judge whether it's a man or a woman looking at that billboard, and will customize its reaction to it. It's actually a not-for-profit, an NGO called Plan UK, and the campaign it's involved in is called Because I Am a Girl. It's a campaign for worldwide education and literacy among girls. So it's a good cause. But basically, they're trying to customize the message to men or women who walk by. So this is already happening. The real challenge here is moving from an old model of privacy, one based on a sense of limiting state surveillance of individuals, to a model of dignity, a model that ensures that each of us can make our way through the world with a reasonable expectation of being treated not as means but as end, a reasonable expectation of being free from profiling, a reasonable expectation of not being tagged as a false positive in some investigation, and a reasonable expectation of being given a full panoply of choices as a consumer or as a voter. We're actually really far from having our combination of laws and policies treat us based on dignity. And part of this is the deep American tradition of individual liberty. As great as that is, it falls short of ensuring dignity. So as we go into this effort of trying to make sense of the effects of big data, I would argue that pushing for a recognition of dignity instead of privacy would actually be a better starting point for this process. And that's where I will end. I have gone on. Thank you very much for listening to me. All right. I talked about a whole lot of things, and I covered a lot of ground, and it's the first time I've given this talk, but I'm scheduled to give it in 4 different places over the next couple months, so you are my guinea pigs. And I know what to do faster and what to do slower and what to do clearer next time, so I apologize if I was a little bit muddy in the middle there. Questions? Places you think I should go that are different? Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry. You were just fast.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Siva. This was a terrific talk, stimulating. And I have a whole bunch of questions I'd like to ask, but I was thinking in the conclusion about one thing in particular, and sort of formulating it just there at the end, so let's see if I can phrase it right. Mm-hmm. One, and my sympathies are as yours are, I think, in terms of where we need to go as a society in terms of policy, but nonetheless, there's an argument to be made that the very bigness of big data provides a certain anonymity.
Yeah, sure.
Just as like when you're walking the streets in a big city, there's a kind of anonymity despite so many people around you.
Yeah.
And that the question of dignity revolves around the individual in a way that, in other words, when big data is simply collected and amassed, and even used for what might be self-serving purposes, but not necessarily malicious purposes like
Right.
marketing. The individual, targeted as a specific person, is not terribly important.
Right.
And in a way, it's that denigration of the individual that seems to be the compromise of dignity.
Yes. So
Right, but the,
Yeah.
but the flip side is that actually provides a protection of privacy violation, because they're not just coming after you
Right.
because of what you did or the way we think government might abuse it. So
Sure.
they seem to me kind of one there's a kind of safety in the crowd, and one there's a denigration of dignity by being reduced to a data point. And they're
yes,
very different.
which is why I wanted to contrast privacy with dignity, because you can have limited effects on privacy, right? So part of the weakness of any critique of this change of these systems is you will say, where is the harm to the individual? And I would point out the handful of false positives, folks who've been pulled off of planes. I didn't even get into the folks who were jailed for months or years at a time, false positives. Those are big individual problems. But then you could bracket that off and say, well, that's a national security law enforcement problem, and you can address the problem locally there, build in safeguards there, or enforce the safeguards we already have. And then you go down a tunnel of that. And I think that you also miss the larger point by doing that. Now, by focusing on individual privacy, as important as that is, and I would never back off on the importance of that, what we don't see is the fact that when you're talking about dignity, it goes actually beyond the individual. It goes to the group in many ways, right? It goes to the fact that people are being profiled commercially, politically, and by law enforcement. And they're not always being profiled ethnically or religiously. They're often being profiled by class, buying behavior, which is less pernicious, but it does mean that it can create all sorts of different ways of creating new profiling that can limit choice, that can limit conversation, that can limit connections, right? Facebook is recommending friends to you constantly based on who it thinks you might like, but it's ignoring all the other people who it doesn't think you might like, but you might actually benefit from, right? So it's guiding you in ways that are not easy to acknowledge or trace. Is that a big problem to each individual? No. Is it a big problem overall? It might be. It might be as it sort of helps govern our social lives and thus our way of engaging with people. That's just one example, right? So that's why there is that. It's not a zero sum between privacy and dignity by any means. But by looking at the vector of privacy, you miss out in many cases on the vector of dignity, which is why it's a much broader conversation. And it's the conversation that happens more often in Europe, although less and less today than it has in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. The emphasis on dignity was a big part of making strong European privacy laws, largely because of awareness of how the Stasi acted and what it would mean through much of Europe to live under a much less liberal government. So yes, I mean, I get your point, and I think that's actually true, that big data as it is generally does very little harm to an individual, but that's why we have to keep pushing it. Now, does it do great harm to dignity beyond that? Not necessarily, but I think there is potential for it, and it's one of the reasons that it's a fascinating problem, right? It's not an easy problem to diagnose. It may not even be a problem, but I would rather have us check into it as we build it, rather than build it and then find out there's a problem, right? So I'm always fascinated by these problems, potential problems that aren't necessarily slam dunks, right? So that was the thing about Google, right? I didn't want anyone to boycott Google. I didn't want anyone to stop using Google. I use it all the time. But I wanted people to be aware of the fact that there may be costs and benefits, and if you're going to use Google, to use it smarter. And if there are times when we need a policy intervention, like for instance, to limit the extent of the data valence or to insist on certain defaults in the system to make sure we're not played by Google, that we need a really rich policy discussion at a high level rather than merely depend on people flipping their own settings, which people never do. Does that cover it, I hope? Hi, in the back.
Hi. One of the claims you made was that most people in America are not aware of they're being surveilled by big data
Right.
entities. Do you really think that's the case, or that people know about it and they don't care? Or
So it's a little bit of both, right? Yes, we're aware of individual cases. I don't think we're aware of the breadth. And I don't. And do we care? Yes and no, right? So there have been a number of studies and surveys about this very question. And the general conclusion of almost all of these surveys, that the University of Pennsylvania Annenberg School has been doing a lot of these. We found, first of all, that people are not aware of the breadth of surveillance, especially by private entities. And they're almost completely ignoring the extent of surveillance by law enforcement. That's just not very aware to most people. I mean, if you're the sort of person who's really concerned about law enforcement, you're probably very aware, right? You're like Tony Soprano. But most people are not. And when they're asked about reactions to certain types of surveillance, they actually are quite opposed to them. And when made aware, are willing to act. So for instance, once you find out the extent to which Facebook watches everything you do and guides your Facebook experience based on what's important to it rather than what's important to you, you're more likely to adjust the privacy settings of Facebook. And so what we're finding also is that young people, especially university-educated people, are in large numbers going in and adjusting their privacy settings because they're the ones who are aware of what Facebook does and how it actually operates, whereas older people don't adjust their privacy settings at all. My mom, for instance, hasn't a clue. She doesn't actually read my books, so sorry, Mom. I think she does. She starts them. I don't know, but so adjusting your privacy settings is something that if you're in your social milieu, it's something you and your friends think and talk about, which is true at universities. You're very likely to care enough to act, but most people don't even know enough to care enough to act. Yes.
Actually, I want to ask a follow-up on that, which is why the larger philosophical question, which is why have we come to a point where we don't care enough? That is,
Yeah.
in my work, I was reading, for instance, the Justice for Overturn COINTELPRO and
Yeah.
the language that he uses. Of course, this comes in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, it comes in the aftermath of the anti-war movement, and a fundamental transformation of the society where dissent is something that is seen as acceptable.
Right.
Because we were COINTELPRO was used against Martin Luther King, against FDS leaders, and so on. And so that battle was won by the time the 70s comes along and COINTELPRO, and the idea that people should be able to organize without the government's watchful eye becomes common. So I wonder if you can sort of step back from the immediate individual
Good.
case and the immediate legal arena to say, what else do you think might have happened? Because Glenn Greenwald, whose work you may know,
Right.
is a columnist for The Guardian and also a lawyer, and he said, one of the fundamental premises of the Constitution has been reversed, and that is individuals have privacy and the government is transparent. And in fact, we have exactly
That's
the
right.
opposite today.
That's right.
We have greater and greater barriers.
So I would argue that notion that the government should be transparent and that individuals should have a sense of privacy was a blip in American history. That it actually was operated for a very short period of time. The American citizens in large numbers only insisted on that relationship in any way but theory in the 1970s. And it quickly went away. Either we got too comfortable, we got too busy, the war ended, it didn't seem so urgent. Who knows what the reasons are? Someone should know the reasons. I mean, the questions you've raised are essential. One of the reasons I think we should take this whole set of changes in society over the past 40 years very seriously is this very question. Have we become so beaten down by it, so inured, so comfortable, so lazy, so secure, so selfish? Maybe. Those are possibilities. Or maybe the government has managed to hide it better from most people. Maybe some of these we have actually decided as a polis that this shift is positive for us. It wouldn't be the first time in history that people gave up a sense of privacy and dignity for an illusion of security, which actually turns out to be an illusion. But so that's, I think that's a research question. There's no simple answer, but I would say that that there's no strong evidence that a lot of people in the United States cared a lot about these issues outside of the post-Watergate, post-Vietnam attempted cleansing of our politics, right when we passed campaign finance reform and all sorts of things that we can't imagine passing today. Yes, sir.
Yeah, from what I understand, though, people tend to appreciate getting coupons and things like
They
that.
do, yes. There is a benefit, yes.
What I've read, that there's been some theorizing and data that's been generated that seems to point to if people are getting something through being surveilled, then therefore surveillance isn't so bad. However, once there starts to be some sort of negative, this is pretty clear,
Right.
all over the room, negative consequences, then there's a bit more questioning.
Yes.
regarding, So then I guess a further question of this would be like, well, what exactly would be disturbing enough
Right.
to our people who aren't the bad people, which I'm a little shaky on those terms,
Yeah.
or doing no good. What would kind of spur people's interest in thinking more about this?
Well, I would like to know the answer to that question as well, right? But I mean, when we think of a trade-off, we sometimes make a mistake of thinking that that our privacy, whatever that means, is something severable or countable that we can. Today, I'm going to trade 10% of my privacy for 20% better Google results. We never actually get to enter that contract or negotiate that contract. What happens is Google decides that's what we want. And I don't know what 10% means. Nobody really knows, right? But Google's justification for massive surveillance of everything we do, giving us the opportunity to opt out if we are even aware of it, is that, don't worry, we're providing better service for you. We just don't have to ask you, right? So privacy advocates in DC have been trying to push the idea that the default should be switched. That when you first enroll in Facebook or you first get your Gmail account, there should be clear language, not unlike the language Elizabeth Warren wrote for credit card disclosure, right? Clear language. This is what we're going to do with your data. Here are the options you can choose to designate what kind of data flows to us and how long we keep it. And in exchange, the following services will come to you. We won't be able to provide localized search if you don't give us this data. We won't be able to provide customized search based on your interests, right? So a sports car fan might get the Jacksonville Jaguars ads, and a Jacksonville Jaguars fan might get the Jaguar car ads, you know, those sorts of things, right? That there actually is a cost and benefit to this. That's a fine thing from the privacy advocate's point of view and from my point of view as well. If we actually engaged in knowing transactions. But still, the idea that privacy is a currency, it just misses the point. Yes, sir. Thank you. Oh, yeah.
I wanted to ask, I guess, broadly, what you think potential maybe like a data jamming would be intervention in response to data.
Yeah.
I think that would be a good or bad thing.
It would not be a good thing for a couple of reasons. One, would not be a good thing. Do I want to go that far? Look, I think that that sort of cultural prankster move can be really helpful in raising awareness. It certainly did a lot in other areas of life. Whether it would be ultimately successful or positive, I don't know. I would say I'm not willing to come down on one side or the other on that question, largely because for me the urgency is to study and to make sense of, and then to, even though I have strong normative goals here, to actually hold back on those until we know what we're dealing with. Right. I mean, the reason that I'm being opinionated up here is to convince you that it's important. But I could be completely wrong about what should happen and the world we should live in. And, you know, I mean, maybe Amazon and Google have it right and the NSA has it right and we're better off living under this. I'm willing to say I could be wrong. But we won't know that until we actually get a sense of what they're actually doing. And we're not allowed to. So, like, there's a lot of talk about issues. Let me bring up one issue that's sort of been in the air for about a decade. So Cass Sunstein wrote an article and then a book arguing that by giving us so much individual control over our mediascapes, we're able to pick channels. We're able to structure our information feeds in ways that just reinforce what we already believe, thus creating conclaves of like-minded people. And he wrote this before what we now call the blogosphere exploded, but then he revised it to show and bring some evidence that this was still the case even in the rise of citizen-driven media. Now, most of his observations and conclusions have been questioned pretty severely by social science. Social scientists have looked at how people actually behave in these different environments and found it's not that bad. So while it is actually very demonstrable with television, cable news. There's not much crossover between Fox and MSNBC viewers except at the gym. But when it comes to the place that Sunstein thought it would be a problem, which is web-based information exchange, there actually is a high level of heterogeneity and argument going on. But put that aside. So it's still a debate. Let's just say it's still a debate. And then there are the next level of it, what Elie Perisser calls the filter bubble, and I wrote about it a bit in my book. I like to say my book came out 6 months before it is, but we actually were talking about it all the way through, which is essentially that Google and Facebook and other firms like this, services like this, because they reward what we tell them we already like, create that same sort of tunneling of awareness. And I actually think that is a real problem as we see our search results narrowed to reflect what we've already expressed. And it's definitely true on Facebook. But it's not the same thing that Sunstein wrote about. So, but again, this whole question of whether the information ecosystem we're operating in is narrowing our perspectives. There is a great set of data that we could use, a big set of data, a big set of big data that we could use to actually get some insight into this. But it's proprietary. It all belongs to Facebook. And Facebook has a team of researchers that have been doing amazing work on this and releasing papers. Papers are releasing memos, really. They're not full papers, and they don't have data sets open attached. So we can't test the data. Basically claiming that Perisser doesn't know what he's talking about, and therefore I don't know what I'm talking about, right? So we're wrong in this conclusion of narrowing, at least through Facebook. Now, Google has its own data. I don't know that they have researchers doing the same work. They probably do. But if we could have some sort of data as rich as the data that Facebook and Google have about us in general, oh my gosh, that would be such a rich collection. Twitter donated many years of its work to the Library of Congress, but no one's figured out exactly how to use the Twitter data in the Library of Congress yet. And Twitter's probably starting to regret that they made this deal right now. There are a lot of questions about how this actually can be used. But Twitter data is never going to be as useful as Facebook or Google because it's smaller data. It's a very elite subset of web users, and they use it instrumentally for a particular purpose. So that's why I think that learning more is imperative right now. That probably has nothing to do with your question.
Thank you.
Sure. Hi. Yes.
Yeah. The federal HIPAA laws prevent, treatment providers and insurance companies
Right.
and related third parties from doing certain things, like sharing and distributing of, private medical information.
Yeah.
So, with that being a law that seems to have a lot of traction and past, why is it that privacy advocates have unable to use that as a foundation for expanding these privacy practices
Right.
to other industries?
So part of the problem, I'm sorry, go on.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the we talked about the discount savings cards,
Yeah.
savings cards. You go to Rite Aid, you get a prescription. It's protected under HIPAA laws.
Yes.
You get a drug like, say, Miralax that is now over the counter.
Yes.
With a wellness card, and all the marketers know you have IBS or some other embarrassing, gastric, whatever, and the marketers are going to do whatever they want.
That's
to
right.
Sell it, and it's unprotected.
Yeah.
So why has the law not made the transition to other consumer markets?
Well, because of particular lobbies, the way particular lobbies work in this. So HIPAAs can't be expanded to muscle out marketing because the drug companies won't let that happen, right? That's the short, cynical answer. So HIPAA is one of the two great examples of pro-privacy, pro-dignity regulations that have come out in the last 30 years or so. There was the federal laws about government information sharing that were simply discarded, not really discarded, but have been complicated. FISA and so forth after that. But so there's HIPAA protecting individual patient records and health data, which had a very strong constituency, especially in the 1980s and 90s during the peak of the HIV/AIDS crisis, when it became really clear the level of everyday discrimination and real harm people could suffer if they were either tagged falsely or or actually not tagged falsely, tagged truly, but still suffer a discrimination and possibly violence. So there's a clear justification for that. It became a very easy public policy argument to make and to maintain HIPAA. The other one is actually credit reports. Credit bureaus are tremendously regulated and effectively regulated, surprisingly regulated. And these regulations go back to the early 1970s, maybe even the late 1960s. And the banks and the credit card and the credit agencies have not been able to undo those. Fortunately, they've tried. But getting back to HIPAA, so HIPAA is an example of a regulation that works mostly for what it's trying to do. It has limitations that you pointed out, but it also has the opposite effect of what I've raised as a set of concerns. HIPAA actually limits the positive use of big data research, right? Because so Johnson & Johnson, to be local, right? Or the Centers for Disease Control or Harvard University Med School could take its patient records if they were in usable electronic form, and with proper safeguards and guidance, and there's a lot of work being done on how that might happen, extract the data in an anonymized fashion and actually contribute to our understanding of how diseases spread, treatments work. So a big part of Obamacare was about funding and generating these data services in ways that are HIPAA compliant, which is one of the reasons this part will take years to develop. So challenge one is getting all of the hospitals in America to use usable data standards that are tradable. That's a big one. That's super expensive. Step two is make sure that the collection of this data and the management of this data is HIPAA compliant, meaning there are no leaks and it's not easily attached to individual records, or actually impossible, ideally. But I don't want to go that far because sometimes it's always still possible. And then the third are safeguards of who gets to manage that data and the limits of where it goes, so it doesn't get abused for marketing purposes and so forth. But ideally, if you can show, for instance, with a good set of data that stents in your arteries in your heart operate better than bypass, then we've learned a tremendous amount and we can save a tremendous amount of money and people will live longer, right? Good results. That's just to pick two controversial and topic, treatments that are in some ways substitutable. It turns out that stents actually don't work, but that's another story. But they're actually dealing with a little bit of data, but we can know more.
Take two more?
Yeah, sure. Nancy, hi.
So this issue about people's privacy and the issues and how they sort of becoming, that we agree there was a lot of concern, particularly after the Patriot Act and across and the library community was very out front, with fighting surveillance. There was a lot of attempt to do in the country, even though our Congress wasn't very responsive. So, but, as so many things, we got sort of privacy fighting fatigue.
Right.
Or privacy protecting fighting fatigue. So last week, after, a lot of attention over the years, last week, the House passed this horrible surveillance bill.
Yes.
It wasn't even in the newspaper.
Well, see, exactly.
What's going on here? Is it a change of political, is it okay under Obama but not under Bush? Or is it?
It wasn't, well.
That was an Obama act, but we haven't had a change in our behaviors in the last.
Okay, but let's get more granular on this.
Surveillance, but we have had a change in political.
No, but let's get more granular on this. The default among politicians in Washington is to grant the government more surveillance power. All right, that is the default state. You have to be given a reason not to do that. It's a collective action problem, right? Classic political science problem. You have a disconnected set of interested people for whom this is not the prime issue. Now, even if 80% of America thought that the Patriot Act went too far, they don't care enough to stop it. But the 20% who think the Patriot Act didn't go far enough probably care more to make it stronger, right? I'm just making stuff up here, but that's a collective action problem, right? This is why, even though vast majority of Americans support gun control, we will never have gun control, because the Americans who are against it consider it a top 2 or 3 issue, right? So what we have here is a movement that really coalesced after the Patriot Act, that grew in strength to the point where through several different Congresses, the Patriot Act was examined again, slightly weakened, humanized, largely because of the work of one particular senator from Wisconsin who's no longer in the Senate, right? So you lose him, you lose the point person, right? So it gets more granular. There are complicated reasons why Congress now is willing to pass all this. And look, it passed the House. Do you really expect the House to do any differently, right? Yeah, right. So, well, probably not. We don't know. But the point is, we don't have, right now, the handful of people who are intense activists about it aren't able to rally the political movement in critical mass that they were able to invoke slowly and steadily over the past 10 years to chip away at the Patriot Act, right? To put library protections in, for one thing, which took a long time to do. It wasn't easy. Well, but something happened which was not likely to happen. And it happened only because a handful of people worked very hard at it. And again, most people might say it's a good idea to do this, but it doesn't matter if they don't care, right? So that's why the notion that Americans do or don't care about privacy, Americans do or don't care about dignity, Americans do or don't care about civil liberties, there's no real way to measure that. We will all say we care when asked. Do we care enough to do anything about it is a different question, right? But as my mother-in-law says, that's how they get you. Hi, yes.
Hi, yeah. Really enjoyed the talk. Got me thinking in directions that I hadn't thought of before.
Oh, glad, thanks. That happened to me too. It wasn't supposed to, but yeah.
It seems like I value surveillance
Okay,
from the standpoint of measuring gross disparities.
good.
Putting a measurement. To me, that's really valuable, just in terms of where folks spend.
Good.
That seems to me that, the point of surveillance becoming a creepy thing, just among, a majority of people, needs to be something that's expressed semantically. And I think that, that might be a way of filtering opinion and value.
Sure.
Maybe more than some other.
Right. Well, that's exactly right. So the idea of creepiness is not really helpful when trying to figure out policy. Because we all get creeped out by certain things, but they may actually be harmless things that creep us out. I mean, we're creeped out by snakes and they're generally harmless, right? We're creeped out by some kinds of surveillance and most of it's generally harmless. Is it harmless at this level? Is it harmless at this extent? That I think we need to investigate. Now, that surveillance is valuable is a really important point. It is socially valuable. If it weren't for improved techniques of surveillance, we would never have discovered the extent of redlining in real estate practices and never been able to address it in terms of policy and law, right? We actually had to get the data. And we weren't going to get the data from banks. We actually had to go in and track deed movements, and someone had to take all this paper and put it into a computer, right? And that's the kind of surveillance that once you know more, you can see things in a different way, you can do exactly what you said, right? You can actually address disparities. You can, the idea of epidemiological big data movements makes surveillance really important in that sense. So surveillance itself is not a pejorative, but the question is, how do we make sure that surveillance is not abused, that the data set's not abused, et cetera? Yeah.
I would think that would be a really creative thing to accomplish, but just creating some boundaries where if a certain object of surveillance exceeds those boundaries, then
Yeah.
surveillance becomes personal. But below that threshold, it's hands-off. Personally, making the online environment kind of creepy, so subjective to an individual, limiting their scope through the web. To me, I can take that as creepy. I could live with it, but I'd rather not. And I think that's the stand that maybe a lot of people might be taking. So, it's speaking of the majority, and not those that exceed, thresholds where danger, could be seen as the object.
Very good. Thank you.